grab a seat then?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hello. Thank you for coming to the Rezzed sessions. Thank you for your patience as well while we sorted out some technical difficulties. Next up, we've got Jon McKellan from No Code, the developers of Stories Untold and Observation, and Matthew Castle from Rock Paper Shotgun. They're going to talk about the making of Observation.
Hello. Oh, wow, it's loud. Hello, welcome to this EGX Rezzed session. How many people in the crowd have played Observation? Oh, wonderful. That's a good section. Well, if you have, you'll know that we're in for a treat. There's a lot of questions to be asked about this game. For those that haven't played it, Observation tells the story of a space station having a pretty bad time, and in which you play as not one of the astronauts on board the space station, but the ship's AI, SAM, Systems Administration and Maintenance. Which obviously raises lots of interesting questions about how you bring an AI character to life, how you bring this environment to life. So we are joined by Jon, who is the director of the game, the founder of No Code. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself for those that maybe don't know who?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I've been working in games for 12 years, I think now, and I started off working in AAA. Working on big MMOs, and then my big kind of break was working on Alien Isolation for 4 or 5 years, or whatever that was. Moved through a couple of different projects and gradually worked my way up from being a graphic designer and UI designer to running a company and writing and directing games, which has been a bit of a trip. Which kind of takes us to now, I guess.
Yeah, so behind us here we have some of the accolades for Observation. A lot of 9 out of 10s.
Yes,
very nice.
That was very good. Yeah.
Lots of loving quotes. I mean, very broadly to start with, how was it like launching the game? How was the kind of reception to it?
It was great. I mean, it was terrifying on the run-up because if you've played it, it's a pretty weird game. And it's kind of a hard game to communicate ahead of time, like what it is you actually do. So we weren't sure how people were going to take it. We thought we had something cool, but you just have to put it out and find out. And luckily, the reaction was really good, and the first reviews came in, and they were all really positive, and we had a big sigh of relief and collapsed on the floor somewhere. So this kind of blows our mind to see that people really got it. What we were trying to do. Yeah.
So I think people who maybe played your first game, Stories Untold, this game came as maybe less of a surprise to them. I think there is a through line there. If you haven't played Stories Untold, it's a series of short, self-contained episodes, each one revolving around a different machine that you kind of interact with in some way. And the through line to Observation that seems clear to me is that this is also a game about interacting with machines, albeit on a grand scale. There's a lot of interface puzzles in there, which we'll get to a bit later. But was it as clear a transition from Stories Untold to Observation, for you guys?
It was kind of strange how this came about. We kind of started No Code to make Observation. That was the game I had in mind when I decided I wanted to go alone and build a team and build our own game. And so we started pitching Observation almost right away. We built a prototype and started pitching it. And we got lots of interest from eventually who signed out Sony and Devolver. But it took so long to literally get paperwork and contracts sorted that we made Stories Untold in the meantime. As a kind of
dashed it off.
Yeah, it was we'd done a game jam of the first episode, The House Abandoned, and it kind of went viral. And we thought, well, we're still waiting on these contracts to come through, and we should maybe do something. And we said to Devolver, we made this one episode, we could maybe do a few more and do an anthology. Are you interested? And they're like, yeah, sure. And we ended up making that, and that actually became a bit of a test bed for what we had planned for Observation in terms of we can try and build some of the ideas that we've got. It's almost like a way to road test them before we do it proper in Observation.
Right.
So there's a lot of commonality between it there.
I think we've actually got your prototype.
Yeah.
Some video of the prototype version here. I wonder if you can maybe just talk us through it, or
Yeah. So the prototype was it was about a 10-15 minute demo, and we've just got a couple of minutes of it here, but
hopefully it doesn't deafen us all.
Yeah. But it pretty much matches what was in the final game. If you've played the intro of the game.
Come in. This is Ellie Fisher on board observation. Please respond. Sam? Sam?
Oh, shit. Sam! Sam, are you there? Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
I am here.
Oh, Sam, thank God. Okay.
So like that initial
Sam,
intro is
locate the
almost
faults
exactly
and
the same
isolate
as what we
them.
shipped
Use
with.
your interior
Even
camera
some of the
system.
assets and that vocal take of I am here is the same one there as we used in the final game, because we just got so used to it. It was like, well, we don't need to re-record that really, because it was great. Yeah, we can kind of keep playing. So this was made by just really myself and Omar is the other co-founder of the studio. He does the audio side of things. So myself and Omar put this together with some help of Stefano, who was an artist on Alien. We put this together in about 6 weeks and took it to
Access control
Sony
overrides now.
at
Exit these
GDC,
doors open.
and they were really interested. But again, it was kind of hard to say what this project really was, and like, how do you make this little 10-minute thing we made into a 7-hour game? To be honest, we didn't really have the answer either. Like, we're still trying to work that out ourselves. So a couple of months, for the next
thanks,
couple of months,
Sam.
we started building more versions of this, and we iterated on it. We kind of and got it down to kind of what you see now. And what we kind of realized is that we actually had the first version was almost the right version, and all the changes and things that we tried to do to make it better actually detracted from the core experience. And by the end of it, our kind of final prototype was basically the first one, just a little bit shorter and a little bit tighter, and that was kind of it.
Okay,
And
get me an angle on
yeah, as
Earth.
far
See
as
if
like
we've
the
lost any
opening
altitude.
act of the game, that first hour is almost exactly the same as the prototype, just we rebuilt it again and made it look a bit better than what it was,
Oh
but
my God, Sam.
literally the same lines of dialogue and the same script and stuff like
did
that.
we
It's
get
kind of
here?
strange, but cool.
I brought you here, it seems.
Why?
I don't know.
So it's pretty much identical in terms of pacing and stuff like that, which is rare. But yeah.
I'm just going to load up some environment screens for this next bit. I don't know how to use these things. This is very apt for this game.
This is all
I'm so
scripted,
bad with
yeah.
yeah.
Technical problems.
Just open it. There we go. So I want to talk about some of the building blocks of the game, some of the different aspects of it. I think Observation has this very interesting tone as it begins as a very sort of highly technical depiction of a working space station, and then it's sort of gradually invaded by other genre influences. Focusing on the space station itself, I mean, how did you kind of decide on this particular look and then capture what feels to me to be a very grounded, sort of realistic depiction?
Yeah, it was. It's funny because we use that term "grounded" a lot in development, which is kind of ironic given that it's literally not grounded. As you're floating around in ZeroG and you're in space. And one of the things about building environments is trying to make it relatable in some way. And the ISS was our main inspiration, obviously, and obviously we cannot relate to that without ever, we've never been in a place like that. Like, literally everyone who's played Observation has not been on a space station. I can confidently say that. So it was about trying to make sure that what we presented was as close to what you were familiar with, and that when you saw an image of our space station, like if you saw it as a thumbnail, you might think it was a photograph of the ISS. And all of that kind of just made everything a little bit more, I don't want to say realistic, but just a bit more relatable, a bit more like this is a normal functioning working environment that is not fantastical. We were very worried right away when you tell people you're doing a sci-fi story about an AI gone rogue, people think about Mass Effect, or they think about, like far future stuff. They think about an AI that walks around like a robot or whatever. And we were like, no, this is more like Siri's gone mad. This is more like Alexa's gone mad, and you don't really have a body, and it's your normal stuff that's breaking down. So it was very important for us to capture what was essentially as close to a real space station as we could. So it was weeks and weeks of research, of digging through books and photographs, and NASA have an archive of pretty much every photograph they've ever taken, and it's all free to use, and it's all free to kind of explore. And so we basically downloaded all of it, and that became our concept art.
That's neat. What about like sci-fi influences from sort of films and whatnot? Because it was quite interesting. I was listening to an interview recently with the director of Ad Astra, the new Brad Pitt thing, and he was talking about like the struggles of working in like the shadow of Stanley Kubrick with 2001. Like, it's defined so much, and he actually said, well, not many people do make science fiction. It's horror or it's fantasy. There's not a lot of, how do you kind of resist the pull of that more sort of stylized thing, I guess?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot. I think there's quite a lot of sci-fi games recently. Like between the time of us pitching this and releasing it, there was a whole bunch of games came out that felt like they were kind of in our territory, and we got a bit worried of like, oh my god, are they going to do what we're doing? And there's literally, like, again, if you've played the game, or if you do play the game, the opening kind of hour is very similar to the opening 20 minutes of the Cloverfield Paradox that came out on Netflix.
Oh, yeah,
and it's
yeah.
like and it's almost like beat for beat the same, and yet that came out like we had already been making a game for a year and a half, and suddenly this film came out that almost had the same thing, but it was a bit more fantastical, a bit more like far future, and I think from a film point of view, 2001 was the obvious reference material for lots of elements throughout the game, but also things like Event Horizon for its weirdness and its kind of strangeness, and this idea that there's the first act of Event Horizon, we'll say, like where something's wrong but you're not quite sure what, was a big influence. And then for kind of a little bit more actiony scenes, it was Gravity, because it was, again, as close to a real world depiction of things going wrong as you could get. So it was always about trying to keep this as like you're an everyman astronaut, if such a thing exists, rather than a hero in space, know. Yeah.
And I'm also quite interested about, you're working here in quite a sterile environment. And I don't mean that as a criticism, like it's an aspect of the space station you guys kind of captured really well. And I'm kind of interested if that raises challenges with environmental storytelling, or of trying to kind of convey characters in a world which is designed to be like highly professional, and it's not full of like daft incidental, it shouldn't be really. It
definitely is. Like, this was a tough environment to build. There's the ISS is very function over form, and I love that. Everything's functional. Nothing is built in a way to look nice. It's built to work. And that's all it does. And that goes down to even their laptops and the screens that are on display in their laptop. They don't have, like in a lot of ISS laptops, they don't even have Windows installed. It's all DOS. It's all as little as possible that can go wrong. And so we had to kind of dive into that side of things, and from a technical point of view, try and make sure that we were keeping things kind of realistic that way. But like in a lot of games, it's like on a technical and an artistic level, it's quite useful to add things like dirt and grime into your environment to break things up so it doesn't look too repetitious. So it looks lived in. You kind of add a layer of dust to everything, and everything feels a bit more like people live there. And that just doesn't exist on the ISS. Everything is, I wouldn't say everything's clean, but there's not dust everywhere. There's not water stains everywhere. There's, it is like say a lot more sterile and harder to make. Like you can't use your normal set of tools to make something look lived in. You can't have a ruffled up blanket because that blanket's going to fly through the air, and ZeroG was a whole other problem with it. But the crew belongings and stuff like that were a huge part of making you care about these characters. And on the space station and in their space station, they're confined to their quarters. So trying to make the rest of the station feel lived in was a real challenge. It was like constant iteration of where we put things and what angles you're going to see it from, because we've got these fixed camera angles, and how to make sure things are kind of facing the right way almost.
Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned like ZeroG there, and obviously the challenges of that. I mean, you have a lot of objects floating around here. I mean, does that kind of, how hard is it to kind of make a convincing ZeroG environment?
It's the worst thing ever, and I'll never do it again. I probably will, but it was really challenging. Like on a technical level, it's pretty straightforward. You just set your gravity to 0, and hey, everything's fine. But for actual things like character animation in ZeroG is really hard because you just cannot simulate it in any way. We're in a way that you could use mocap. We considered the idea of putting people up in these vomit comets. Oh yeah. We thought maybe we could do that, but we'll get like 60 seconds of mocap for £16,000. Maybe not. Maybe that's not going to work. So this is Chris on a bar stool, or drumming stool, I think, being spun round by other people in the room. And it looks madness, but it actually works. We used the mocap system he's got on his perception neuron, I think it's called. And it's like an accelerometer-based mocap system, so it's cameraless. And it meant that we could actually capture bits, like we could capture his upper body and his lower body separately if we wanted. Which is what we did for a lot of things. So we'd capture the arm movements and the way that you would interact, but we'd animate the legs separately and do things like that. So pretty much every animation had a problem associated with it of how we can convincingly, get Emma to move from one end of the station to the other, and just constantly being mindful of it, like all the things that you take for granted. He's been pulled along by a cable on a mechanics thing, can't really recall. It was really challenging because you would do little things and then have to stop and restart. It'd be like, there's a great video online of an astronaut after he'd been on the ISS for 3 months, I think, and he's got a pen in his hand, and as he's talking, he just lets go of the pen in midair and it falls to the floor, and for a second his brain doesn't compute, and it's because in space they could just let go of it and then pick it up again, and it would just sit there. And so we found ourselves during mocap, like, you're having people like put stuff down, and you don't put stuff down on space, you just let go of it, or you stick it to something, like there's Velcro everywhere, and you just attach it to a wall. So we'd be doing things in mocap with either Chris or Kez, and it would just be little things. You go, stop, we have to do that again, because you wouldn't do this, or you wouldn't be able to move that object in that way without it pulling you as well, and never again.
And then, throughout the station, you have the machinery itself. As I said earlier, in Stories Untold, each episode is built around, one or two kind of focused devices. Here you have this huge mechanical world. Anything in it could be a plaything. How did you kind of decide on what people would be kind of interacting with? Where does that come from?
A lot of that came from the story. One of the things we try and do, which I think is different from
I'm going to change this picture because it's a bit weird.
Chris is going to love me for this. It was kind of, we try and make sure that our puzzle mechanics are always part of the story and not just a puzzle you solve to progress the story. Like, we don't want to come up with just a fancy way of turning the page in a book. We want to make sure that you had a real good reason to do that and that you're invested. So all the puzzles in Stories Untold and Observation are rooted in the narrative rather than just the puzzle for puzzle's sake. So, once we blocked out the full story of like, well, we know we need to, get outside the ship, so we need to use an airlock. Let's make sure the airlock then becomes part of the puzzle, not putting on the suit, not, or whatever else could happen in that section. It would just be like, okay, we need to devise an airlock interface, try and make it like I wouldn't say the airlock interface is a puzzle as such, but you still don't get told how to use it, and you have to just kind of take it in for a second. And a lot of our puzzles are like that. They're not actually that hard. They're just about being presented with something for the first time, and both as a player and as a character being asked to solve it immediately as if you should know.
Yeah.
So as a player, you're kind of going, well, I've never seen this airlock thing before. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. And the character in the game is saying, come on, Sam, you know this. You should be able to do this. And literally putting you in the same position as Sam as a player. And that's a lot of our puzzle mechanics are about that.
And more of a broader question, but like, where does your like personal obsession with kind of interfaces and the kind of cryptic nature of sort of industrial design kind of come from? I mean, do you like... have you ever met like a microwave you haven't been able to program? What's the...
Yes. I don't know, like there's a couple of things. In Stories Untold, it was all about nostalgia. All these tools that you use were things like microfiche machines. I worked in a bank when I was 19, processing title deeds for mortgages and storing them on microfiche, and I had to use microfiche machines all the time. And I loved it because it was this weird old interface with a glow in it, and and I've been like, I don't know, just kind of curious about that stuff for a long time. Where observation is obviously not about nostalgia, it's still about technology not being the answer, and that these machines are not going to save you. It's just they're part of your tool set, but they're all flawed, and everything about the whole thing is flawed. And the change for observation is you are that technology, and you are flawed, and you have issues with it. And as a player, you bring those flaws as well. So I'm not sure where the obsession came from. There's just something about analog VHS stuff that I just enjoy kind of mucking about with. Like on Alien Isolation, I did a lot of VHS. I'd record the game onto tape and then play it back and capture that and then mess up the cables on the way. And I still do that. Like I've done that for some of the stuff in observation. It's just like I just enjoy playing with electronics, but I should never be allowed near electronics.
Yeah, and it's interesting there as well, because you say you are the technology. I mean, trying to design puzzles from the perspective of not a human interacting with these things, how does that alter like your approach to sort of puzzle and world design?
I don't know. Like I'm not sure if it would change things that much because of the way we try and do puzzles anyway. Like say, it's always about. I mean, most of our puzzles are usually about handing you an instruction manual of some sort and a problem, and then having you try and put two and two together. So it's not a cerebral task or weird like what's the word? Yeah, it's not like an abstract puzzle where it's just like, okay, you've got to find 3 symbols to unlock this door, and you'll go find those 3 symbols and unlock the door. It's about like, okay, I've got this interface in front of me that I don't understand, and a clue that will help me understand that somehow, whether it's like a first instruction or a little legend, a little key that will tell you kind of what things might mean, and then letting you kind of push and pull and find your way around. So in Stories Untold, it's very physical. It's like, use this stuff to work out what it is. And we kind of like, those kind of activity tables that kids have, and you kind of spin things and you move things around, and it's kind of like that, but for adults, as you get to play with it to try and suss out how it works. And for Sam, because the only difference was none of that could really be physical, it all had to be within a digital realm, something he could connect to and then be given a kind of abstracted interface of that. So it'd be like power grids or wireless router software and things like that, like stuff that he would have an access. So the rule was always Emma will do the physical side and Sam will do the technical side. So she'll open the door for you, or like when you're in the second act of the game, she'll kind of, you tell her you need a door open, she'll open it for you, but you'll be the one that hacks into a computer and does a thing that only a computer can really do.
Also, another difference between Observation and Stories Untold is obviously Observation's a much bigger game, has to hold your attention, run the story for a lot longer. What challenges does that raise with regards to pacing, coming from an episodic game to this more substantial story, and how did you tackle them?
Yeah, pacing in Observation was tricky from the start. Originally, Observation was going to be an episodic game in the same way Stories Untold. We talked, at the very beginning, we talked about releasing it episodically, like, the same way Telltale or Life is Strange would do. I'm a big fan of episodic TV and really love like ending on a cliffhanger and moving on to the next thing. But gradually we realized the story we were telling didn't quite fit that structure. So yeah, this is an example of our our beat sheets. So these are like sections of the game broken down into a spreadsheet to try and work out what is happening and when. So this is like a chapter-specific section where these kind of columns represent an indeterminate unit of time. Sometimes it'd be like, they're all roughly 5 minutes of gameplay, or you don't quite know how long it's going to take someone to solve something, but along those lines, we'd have like a narrative description of what's going to happen in the story, and then the gameplay description is what the player is going to be able to do about that, which game mechanics it kind of references, and so on and so forth. So we'd break down all our scenes into this beat sheet, and that would become a way for us to track what we were building and how we were building it. So that's a kind of wider view of some of the, I think that goes all the way along, of the story as a whole and how we were tracking our pacing of every chapter. And this went through like iteration throughout the entire project. Chapters would get added, chapters would get taken away, problems would get moved around, and sections of the game would get cut if they didn't feel right, or you couldn't get from here to here quick enough, and you'd lose something by having something that you didn't really need in the middle. We'd then take it out and reshuffle, and the whole game was built with these, we call them scene sequencers. That was our way of tracking individual kind of like mini chapters, and they'd all be strung together, and we could rearrange them depending on how it felt to play. And this is some more of it. This is some of the stuff we'd done right at the start when we were trying to work out the pacing of not just the story. Like a lot of people think about pacing as just like how much information is given to you and when, and keep making sure that you're always learning something as the game progresses and you're not just sitting with the same facts for too long. But we're also doing that with game logic, with features, like how long do you spend with the same tool set? So when do you unlock the ability to do the spheres, for example, like where do they come in it? And so right at the beginning of the project, you're taking your best guess of like, okay, we'll start off with voice authentication, we'll then give you camera controls, we'll then give you system diagnostics, how often are you going to use these tools? And that even helps you things like power routing, which we cut eventually.
That sounds spicy. I'm sad you cut that.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Power routing.
It was kind of cool, but it's probably as boring as it sounds, really. But in something like that, you can see, well, the story only needs it twice, and it's going to take a lot to make that one feature. And if you don't like that feature, it's hard to justify keeping it in. So we do this kind of thing at the start, and then just keep iterating on that to try and find your pace. And a lot of it comes down to the artistic side of just playing it over and over again and trying to get used to where those beats land, and it's you can't rely on the spreadsheets for everything, but they were a big help.
Yeah, well, speaking as a player of the game, I thought it was one of the major strengths of it was how much I felt it changed and how kind of defined each section was. Like I really felt like it had big story beats and themed areas, which I didn't really expect it to have. I thought it was, especially given the how sort of trapped the protagonist is.
Yeah. Well, that was it. I mean, a lot of the pacing was down to like making sure that within any kind of 10, 15 minute bit of gameplay, you would learn something new or find something that would at least unlock a bit more story or unlock a bit more intrigue in the player. Like, a new mystery would be presented and another one resolved and stuff like that. And you don't want to just like set up a bunch of mystery and then not deal with it until the end of the game. You have to kind of like meter that stuff out and make sure that people are going to get some satisfaction as they play. And those questions will inevitably lead to more questions, but that's the fun of a mystery-themed game,
I also wanted to ask about the relationship between Sam and Emma. It's integral to the whole thing. Could you talk a little bit about creating those characters and maybe specifically the process of casting them? On Sam in particular, the voice is so integral to the whole thing working.
So both Keziah Burrows and Anthony Howell, who played Emma and Sam respectively, they both worked on Alien. I met them whilst doing some work on Alien Isolation and became kind of good friends with them. And with Sam, there he is. He was Anthony was who I wrote the character for. In mind, like it was his voice I was using in my head when I was writing all the lines, and I'm just praying that he was going to be available. And luckily he was, which was great. And he's like a proper, like a real, like Shakespearean actor. Like when he was doing this session that night, he was doing like a Shakespeare play with Jon McKellan that night, and he was doing that for like 6 months or something like that. It was like King Lear or something, and he's just like, he's a really good actor, and a lot of people think that. We've done a lot of work to Sam's voice in the game. Like we've done a lot of post-processing, and we've cut it up in a way to make it sound like it's been spliced together. That's all live. It's all Anthony.
Really?
He's just a legend at that stuff. And yeah, he's incredible. So the part was kind of written with him in mind, and everyone we didn't audition anyone else for the role. It was like we went straight to him and said, "Can you do this?" Like once we'd been greenlit, it was like, "Can you do this?" And he's like, "Yeah, sure." And I was like, "Thank God, we've got Sam." For Emma, it was a little bit different. I'd originally went to the casting group that we work with and the audio team we work with to try and find an Emma. And we went through a couple of different people at different stages in the project. I wasn't sure who she was, and I wanted whoever we cast as Emma to bring something to that. I'm not a female astronaut, and I don't know how a female astronaut would behave and stuff, and so I'm not going to be kind of so arrogant as to pretend that I know that stuff. Yeah. So I want to get some other perspective in there and get some insight and help evolve that character with someone. And so I'd been through a couple of different people with mixed results. They were all good, but not quite feeling like this was the right person. And so I'd kept in touch with Kez since Alien, and I messaged her on Facebook one night. We had a deadline for an internal milestone to show the publisher, and it's like, we really need some dialogue for this thing. And so I messaged Keziah, who's got her own studio, her own like home studio, and I said, could you record some stuff? We're working on a game and we need some voice. And she's like, okay. So I sent her the script and very little direction. And I just said, and she was really happy because she's Welsh. And I said, just use your own accent. Like, you don't have to pretend to be American. Just be yourself. And she was over the moon at that. And just said, just do your thing and we'll use it. Like, we're not sure what we're going to do yet. And she sent it back and it was perfect. Like, very little feedback needed. It was just like, okay, this turns out the answer was in front of us the whole time. So we cast Kez, we got her up to do some of our little indie mocap and do recording sessions. And she kind of became part of the team, and we had an initial couple of sessions of recording with her. And then after that, like, we had a lot of rewrites and a lot of like changes to, obviously Emma's the one that, her character is the one that kind of tutorializes you through the game and teaches you how to do things. So we do some like focus testing, and people would get stuck at a puzzle. If we were going to give a prompt and a hint, it has to come from her, which means you have to get new lines recorded. So there was this constant kind of back and forward with her, but because she had her own studio and we knew her really well, it would just be like, can you do some more lines? Send her some stuff, and she'd send it back. And it was this constant kind of update, and it was fantastic, and we'll definitely be working again on more stuff as we go forward, because it's like you find people you rely on, and it's good to keep them around,
It's cool. Speaking of changes, actually, one of the things I've always been a little puzzled about was that in earlier preview stages, I heard you talk about the game almost having a parallel storyline that would be playing back on Earth, and I didn't know if this was just like lore that you'd written like in your head, or if it was actually a thing.
Yeah. So that was actually a thing for a long time. And it was a really, really, really tough call to cut. But we had a narrative strand where regularly throughout the game, it would cut back to a kind of tribunal talking about this mission after the fact. So it was going to it would go back to mission control, and it would be an interview with one of the controllers of mission control and someone asking them about literally what you've just seen and what you've just played, it'd be like they were reviewing that footage and trying to discuss what happened and what went wrong and what it meant. And it added this extra layer of things, which I thought was really cool, where it kind of posed questions that made you look at what you just played in a different light. So you're like not really like one of the things that comes up quite early on in those old interview sequences was like, can we trust the footage? Like Sam is a super advanced computer. Can he essentially deep fake something? Like, do we know what we're seeing is real? And it plants a seed of mistrust of like, well, am I the unreliable narrator now? And is what I'm doing what they're seeing and stuff? And I thought it was a really fascinating journey. But ultimately, it broke things up a lot. And one of the interviews in the middle of the game was with Emma, and it kind of posed this idea that, you know, oh, okay, so Emma gets home and she's fine, and now we're going to learn some more about that. And that was like, I loved that reveal of having an interview halfway through with the protagonist that you think's maybe not going to make it, or they're going to be stranded out, and it kind of like goes, okay, she gets home, and then start to play with what that might mean, and without spoiling too much, but for those who have played it through, knowing that is possible, to have an interview with Emma after the fact, given everything else that happens in the game. But it just didn't quite work as far as pacing goes, as far as like our ability to deliver it on time and in a way that didn't break things up. It kind of felt like every 20 minutes of gameplay, you got a 5-minute cutscene just explaining.
The Kojima approach.
Kind of, yeah, kind of. A little bit too much exposition, and the more we kind of agonized over it, it was a really tough call, because it'd been in the game for so long, it'd been in the story for so long. But then we let a good friend of mine, play the game without them in it, and he didn't notice that we'd cut anything, and that's when we knew that they weren't important. You know, we knew that they don't need to be there. That's a layer to the story that doesn't have to exist, and doesn't make it any better. You know.
Sure, but we've got
a short clip, and this is like
clip of
super early days. This is like really, really. So it's pretty rough draft.
What are you feeling right now? Tell us what you think when you watch that back.
It's not the first time I've watched it, but it doesn't get any easier, if that's okay.
Do you remember anything about these events?
No, of course not. I mean, you can hear me say what would have been my last words in the audio. I mean, what do I... what am I supposed to do with that?
You have no recollection at all?
You know, in a way, I wish I could remember more, but then when I see that footage of me dying, basically, I'm glad I can't.
So like to me, that was like, whoa, what does that mean? But it just didn't resolve the way that it could have done, and the ending of the game was quite different as a result, and that version of that ending is definitely worse than the one we shipped, I think. And so it was the right call to make, but it was a really hard one, because I love adding these layers in. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I've been told I've got to wrap it up. Have we got any time for questions, Graham?
We've got time for like one question, if there's anyone in the audience.
Have you any questions about observation? Ask them now. This is your only chance.
Well, thank you very much, Jon.
Jon, thank you so much for talking us through the game. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you for showing us some of the unfinished things. Really appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks very much.
And look forward to whatever you're working on next.
It's exciting.
Cheers. Give him a big clap.
Cheers.
Come on. Whee!